Hello, my name is Art Goodin. I'm a student in Dr. Newman's PS 618 Public Policy Analysis course at Southeast Missouri State University. This presentation is a summary of Chapter 11 of the Craft and Furlong public policy text that we're using in the class, and it covers environmental and energy policy. I'm familiar with this topic because I've read the chapter and have done some research toward developing this presentation. But I'm also familiar with this topic because I've worked in the field of environmental science since 2002 and have picked up some knowledge along the way. The chapter has 6 objectives listed at the beginning. I think if those are the objectives to be covered when reading it, they should also be the objectives to be covered when viewing this presentation. So I'm going to lay these out here, and I believe we will cover all of these. Throughout the course of this presentation, it's my hope that you'll understand the history of government involvement in environmental and energy policy. I hope to explain the nature of environmental and energy policies and the key concepts associated with them. I'll identify areas of consensus and conflict in addressing environmental and energy concerns. I hope to compare major U.S. environmental policies and their effects, and also discuss major U.S. energy policies and their effects, and analyze a select issue in environmental and energy policy. Environmental policy is broad in scope and not always easy to define. This is because the questions of what is the environment and how should it be used don't really have universal answers. For example, policymakers should consider, is the environment just the environment, or are we humans and our actions part of it? Are natural resources there for our exploitation, or should they be protected? Is clean water policy about water quality, or is it about public health? These questions aren't easy to answer, and the answer given by anyone will likely vary quite a bit based on his point of view. Policy decisions are made at the local, state, federal, and international levels, ranging from decisions about whether or not to put a recycling trailer in the Bloomfield, Missouri City Hall parking lot, all the way to the latest United Nations sustainability projects. Some policies are old and some are new. Some work very well and some need to be changed. And as with any policy, policymakers need to balance many interests to develop a successful policy compromise. For example, the often competing interests of business and its desire to be profitable and competitive and the interests of environmental protection must be reconciled to produce an environmental policy that's acceptable to both. This certainly isn't easy. The last 3 presidential administrations have tried to streamline or reinvent environmental regulation, but have not been very successful due to political constraints. Probably since the beginning of time, there have been cultural norms in place to protect the natural resources essential to that culture. These could have been as simple as understanding that you get your drinking water upstream of camp rather than downstream of it, or that you walk a respectable distance away from the chief's tent before doing your business, if you know what's good for you. But as society evolved and became more complex, a need for greater environmental regulation became apparent. In ancient times, for example, the Roman Empire had law pertaining to the discharge of smells and of wastewater from one property to another. And, remarkably, for a culture that's often associated with cruel punishment, such as crucifixion or execution by gladiator, they also had a legal prohibition against denying prisoners with access to light and air, as those were considered essential for life. Such ancient policies weren't entirely a European construct either. For example, Indian culture has placed protections on some plants and animals by declaring them as sacred. The image on your screen right now is a painting of the Kulajari massacre, in which a group of people in a village in India were killed trying to oppose the harvesting of a grove of sacred trees. A great deal of environmental policy in the United States was enacted during the 20th century. The U.S. Forest Service was started in 1905, and the National Park Service was started in 1916, both the result of policy to protect natural resources. In the 1930s, President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal included policies directed at flood control and at stopping erosion. During this time, the Tennessee Valley Authority was also established. The TVA is a government corporation that's charged with increasing development in the Tennessee River Valley by providing electricity to rural areas for both businesses and residential use. In establishing the TVA, Congress set a precedent that government land use planning could be used to provide for the common good. There was not much coherent national energy policy during this time period, with the exception of policy directed toward nuclear energy. During the 1940s and 1950s, our nation had policy that was set up to protect and promote the nation's nuclear power industry. Environmental policy in the United States really took off in the late 20th century, particularly in the 1960s and 1970s. Our text states that this change started after the Second World War, when our industrial development and increased wealth and desire for improved quality of life and a cleaner and more enjoyable environment. Research during this time also led to an increase in knowledge about environmental quality and the negative effects of pollution. In the early 1960s, Congress passed several pieces of legislation that protected natural resources, such as the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act and the Wilderness Act. Legislation aimed at pollution and environmental quality came later in the 1970s. By this time, the public had become so concerned about worsening environmental quality that they demanded their representatives do something about it. This ultimately led to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970. The EPA was formed by President Nixon after a commission he established recommended that all federal environmental efforts be reorganized into one executive agency so that research and regulation could be coordinated by that one agency. After that came passage of many pieces of legislation aimed at controlling pollution to be administered by the EPA. There are many major federal environmental policies. We'll run through a few of them here. NEPA, or the National Environmental Protection Act, has been called by some the Magna Carta of environmental regulation, and referred to as such because it requires transparency in federal projects and allows for public participation in government decisions. It's also encouraged similar legislation in over 160 other countries. NEPA requires the development of an environmental impact statement before federal projects can progress. A weakness of NEPA is that once the statement is prepared, the actors don't necessarily have to do anything about it. The Clean Air Act was passed in 1970. It regulates air pollution emissions from stationary and mobile sources. The act authorized EPA to set national ambient air quality standards and to take steps to ensure that all areas were in attainment with those standards by 1975. The Clean Air Act was amended in 1977 and again in 1990 to set new attainment date goals. The Clean Air Act regulates hazardous air pollutants and requires sources to use the maximum achievable control technology to reduce air pollution. The Clean Water Act, there was federal regulation in place as early as 1948 in the form of the Federal Water Pollution Control Act dealing with water pollution. But those laws were reorganized and expanded into the Clean Water Act in 1972. The Clean Water Act set water quality standards for lakes, streams, rivers, etc. It also prohibited the point source discharge of pollutants into waters of the U.S. without a permit. The Clean Water Act set up the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System to accomplish that. And NPDES was intended to stop the discharge of pollutants to surface waters within 5 years. As within the Clean Air Act, this didn't happen on time, and now NPDES permits are issued and reissued on a 5-year cycle. FIFRA, or the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. FIFRA regulates the distribution, sale, and use of all pesticides in the United States. EPA must register pesticides before they can be used in this country, and to get a pesticide registered, it must be shown that the pesticide will not generally cause unreasonable adverse effects on the environment. A common phrase associated with FIFRA is "the label is the law," meaning that all of the legal uses and precautions associated with the pesticide must be listed on the label by the producer and must be followed by the user. So, in addition to being dangerous, using a pesticide incorrectly is also a violation of federal law. The Safe Drinking Water Act of 1974 authorized EPA to set minimum standards to protect the safety of drinking water and required public water supply systems to comply with these standards. This law protects waters that are being used for drinking as well as waters that could be used for drinking, and protects both surface and subsurface waters. The Safe Drinking Water Act also sets standards to protect drinking water aquifers from the underground injection of fluids. For example, fracking fluids or the subsurface disposal of hazardous waste. RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, passed in 1976. RCRA charged EPA with the responsibility to control hazardous waste. Generators were made responsible for their hazardous waste from the cradle to the grave, or from the time of generation to the time of their ultimate disposal. RCRA sets a standard for tracking hazardous waste and ensuring that every bit of those wastes is accounted for and disposed of properly. CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act. This act is often just called Superfund, and it provides for a federal superfund to clean up abandoned or uncontrolled hazardous waste sites and spills. CERCLA additionally allows EPA to recover costs from responsible parties who have caused those spills or uncontrolled sites. The Superfund's Amendments and Reauthorization Act of 1986 updated CERCLA and also added the Environmental Protection and Community Right to Know Act, EPCRA. This act required the reporting of the storage and use of hazardous substance at facilities to local emergency planning committees and the State Emergency Response Commission to help those organizations plan for chemical emergencies. EPCRA was developed in response to the fatal union carbide methyl isocyanate release in Bhopal, India, that killed many, many people, and then a smaller release shortly thereafter at another union carbide facility in Institute, West Virginia. Some common themes in environmental regulation. Because environmental regulation touches so many aspects of our society, like clean air, clean water, power generation, automobiles, consumer products, etc., it is often involved in contentious debate. And even though EPA has a multi-billion-dollar budget and is the largest federal executive agency, its workload is still too great. While environmental policy tries to control nearly everything, the agency charged with carrying out that policy often can't ensure that everyone is in compliance. Another common theme is that most federal environmental regulation is direct regulation. Standards are set, the government enforces them. And another theme is that environmental regulation is affected by political issues. EPA has a different flavor depending on who is in the White House at that time. For example, it would be hard to imagine the Keystone XL pipeline being held up by the administration of oil-friendly George W. Bush like it is by the Obama administration. Political issues often involve the public and other stakeholders. Businesses often criticize environmental regulation as job-killing laws, while environmentalist organizations often bemoan the same regulation as too weak or catering to industry. Both groups sue EPA often in an attempt to influence policy and regulation. How well do environmental policy programs work? They work pretty good, pretty well, sometimes too well. Some aspects of environmental quality or environmental policy are hard to measure or to even get consensus about what is being measured or what the measures mean, but we are making demonstrable progress with our environmental policies and regulations. For example, between 1980 and 2012, air pollution caused by the 6 criteria air pollutants that EPA measures, particulate matter, ground level ozone, carbon monoxide, sulfur oxides, nitrogen oxides, and lead, that pollution has decreased by 67% over that time period. And during that same time period, our country saw growth in GDP, population, miles driven, energy consumption, etc. That means we're doing more of the things that have historically caused air pollution and polluting a whole lot less. But maybe the environmental policy programs that we have are working too well. I've been told by many old timers who lived through the very polluted environment in the 1970s both in and out of the environmental science field, that air and water quality is dramatically better than it was back then. One drawback to this otherwise good news is that with our cleanest in decades environment, the need for environmental regulation seems less important, causing the public and other stakeholders to support less regulation when it will impact other aspects of their lives, like the price of a hamburger or their water and sewer bill. Take the image of the Beijing skyline you're looking at right now. If your air quality were always like the bottom image, it would not probably be too hard to convince you of the importance of air pollution controls, even if they came at a little cost. But if controls were enacted and the sky looked like the above image, you might not see the importance of more controls, especially if they prohibited you from doing something you enjoyed. Environmental policy options for the future. Several alternatives have been proposed for environmental policy in the future. Industry, environmentalists, and the government are all interested in varying degrees in policy that is less costly, produces greater results, and is less cumbersome. One of these is market-based regulation. In this system, a finite amount of pollution is authorized for a geographic area, a watershed, etc. The polluters within that area are assigned pollution credits for their portion of the pollution and can use them to keep polluting or sell them to other facilities that use the money to upgrade so they pollute less and need less credits. Another proposed idea for the future is the increased use of incentives that encourage non-polluting behavior or that address a source of pollution that is impractical to regulate. Incentives systems are already in place to address areas of non-point source water pollution. Government cost share grants are available to farmers who wish to install water quality improving structures like terraces or ponds that prevent the loss of sediment from their property. Transparency and disclosure have been proposed as alternatives for policy and regulation in the future. The idea here is that if companies had to make their environmental impacts known and available to the public, there would be more pressure for them to act better. Another option for the future mentioned by the text is flexibility. By allowing all stakeholders to collaborate on future environmental regulations, it is likely that greater compromises could be reached. When thinking of stakeholders, it should also be noted that governmental agencies could also be seen as stakeholders and could make significant contributions to the discussion around new policy or legislation. An example of this would be the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the U.S. Forest Service commenting on and participating in the development of policy that, while not directly related to their forests or wildlife, might impact those resources that they're charged with protecting. And those agencies would be interacting with other agencies, acting as expert agencies. Our text also mentions decentralization as a policy option for the future. We're already doing this, in fact. EPA has granted many states primacy for several environmental media, such as the case in Missouri, where the state has primary authority for enforcing environmental laws pertaining to water, hazardous waste, etc. EPA still retains oversight authority and can do follow-up inspections behind state inspectors or choose to inspect facilities on their own. Most of these ideas for the future regulation are included in EPA's current Next Generation Compliance Program. This program aims to take advantage of new tools and approaches while strengthening vigorous enforcement of environmental laws. Next Generation Compliance will feature regulations and permits that are easier to understand and implement, the use of advanced emissions and pollution detection technology, a move to electronic reporting, increased transparency and data sharing, and innovative enforcement approaches to improve compliance. Natural resource policy. The environmental policies I've already talked about really deal with protecting environmental quality. For example, how clean the air or streams are. And while environmental quality is greatly impacted by the use of natural resources, these policies don't speak to the specific use of those resources. Natural resource policy, on the other hand, governs the management of those resources. They tell us how our public lands, forests, parks, plants and animal species, and biological diversity should be used. There is often great disagreement on this issue. Most of our current natural resource policies strive for multiple use. By setting this standard, Congress tried to compromise between the often competing interests of environmental protection and environmental growth. Multiple use is really evident in the western U.S. There are a lot of public lands, and recreation often recreation areas often abut mining areas. Some places out west, folks might like to see areas like the image you're looking at protected for their natural beauty, while another group might like to see those areas opened up to um, off-road vehicle use. Maybe behind that ridge too, there's a mining concern. There's a lot of activities that occur, very close together on these public lands, and people enjoying those activities might not always agree on what the best use of that land is. The Endangered Species Act is also a natural resource policy. This act allowed the government to protect species that were close to extinction by prohibiting taking of the species by hunting or fishing or by destruction of habitat. This policy has had great successes, but has also drawn considerable opposition by property rights advocates. One area of controversy with regard to our natural resource policy is that of resource subsidies and user fees. Currently, users of public lands must pay the government user fees for that right. In many cases, however, the fee paid to the government is less than the value of the resource being extracted. In cases such as this, the government can said to be subsidizing the user of the natural resources. An example of this is timber harvesting in national forests. Studies have shown that the Forest Service often spends more maintaining the logging roads that are used by the logging companies than the Forest Service ever recovers in fees paid by those loggers. So in essence, the people are taking a loss to maintain roads so that a private company can then go in, take trees, and sell them for a profit. Some, maybe not the loggers or the miners that benefit from resource subsidies, but some believe that this situation is not acceptable and advocate for an increase in user fees so that private industry pays at least its fair share for natural resource use. It can be said that our nation does not have a coherent energy policy. We have policies that pertain to specific sectors of the energy industry, but they don't always mesh well. In the 1940s, the U.S. nuclear energy benefited from legislation that gave it many subsidies and protections. Other energy sources such as coal, oil, gas, and solar have also benefited from subsidies, but nuclear was really the rising star of energy back then. In the 1970s, when OPEC embargoed our oil and gas prices rose dramatically, there was an attempt at a comprehensive energy policy, but it failed. One policy that was eventually passed in the 70s, though, was CAFE, the Corporate Average Fuel Economy Standards. These standards dictated that the average fuel economy of an automobile manufacturer's sales would have to meet certain targets or there would be penalties. And while this did drive an increase in fuel economy, loopholes in CAFE also led to the SUV boom that started in the 1990s, which then in turn led to an overall drop in national fuel economy that didn't begin to reverse until gas prices spiked during the Great Recession of the late 2000s. With today's concerns about global warming and increasing greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere, some policymakers have proposed a carbon tax that would tax the generation of energy from fossil fuel sources. Such a policy should reduce energy consumption overall or drive energy providers to more carbon-friendly energy sources. So after discussing environmental policy and defining some issues there, we'll look at an example of a specific environmental policy issue, and what better one than to discuss right now than climate change. Climate change is a contentious issue. Some people really believe, that is the single most important threat facing humanity and the earth ever. Others believe, and really believe, that it's a communist plot hatched by Al Gore and the Illuminati to take away their money, freedoms, and V8 engines. As with most policy issues, the answer is probably somewhere in the middle. Scientists and science disagree about the existence and extent of climate change, global warming, and the effects of greenhouse gases. Most scientists support the theories that show climate change is being caused by man. But is this because they have rock-solid evidence, or is it because they're worried about being labeled a climate change denier and losing credibility and funding in their field? As a scientist, I was taught from the beginning that it's okay if your theory turns out to be wrong, because we often learn more from a failure than we do from success. The abandonment of this principle among those who cannot fathom that anthropogenic climate change is anything other than 100% undeniable fact makes me question their motives. International agreements such as the Kyoto Protocol have been reached regarding carbon emissions in an attempt to control climate change. However, some developed nations, such as our own, have refused to sign the agreement, and developing nations are not held to as high of a standard, thus allowing them to contribute more greenhouse gases to the environment. With a truly global problem, greater coordination and compliance with whatever policy is finally developed will be necessary. There are economic issues related to climate change policy. Climate change policy is going to cost somebody a lot of money. The trick in developing a good climate change policy will be developing a compromise that achieves the goal of the policy while ensuring that the costs are paid fairly by everyone who benefits from the policy. Taxes will be a regulation-based way to achieve the policy goals. Taxes can be used to make some energy sources more expensive, which should reduce their usage. Money generated from those taxes can then be used to subsidize other activities that support the policy goals. Cap and trade of carbon credits is a market-based way to achieve policy goals. In this system, the market will decide what a unit of pollution is worth, and companies will come up with the most efficient way of generating the least number of pollution units if it's costing them money. Fuel economy standards can also be used to achieve policy goals. One concern with this would be that they make car ownership so expensive that it's inaccessible to those without a lot of resources. There are ethical issues related to climate change policy. Intergenerational equity is a term that refers to our need to be fair to future generations. As climate change is thought to be a problem that will get much worse in the future, is it fair for us to continue to use resources that will harm our grandchildren or their grandchildren? Conversely, if technology progresses to a point in the future where climate change can be reversed easily, should we even worry about it now? Is lowering the current standard of living really necessary if we won't have a real impact on the future either way? There's also the ethical issue of the effects of climate change and climate change policy on the developed and developing world. The developed world uses most of the world's energy. The U.S., for example, uses 25% of the world's energy and produces 20% of the world's greenhouse gases. Is this whole mess our fault? Should we be taking a leadership role? Conversely, the developing world is often given a pass for current and future greenhouse gas emissions. Is it fair? Do they get to pollute up to Western levels before we start worrying about them? If it's really a problem, why can't they stop now just like us? Finally, there's the concept of environmental justice. EPA defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. In other terms, environmental justice means that everyone should have the same environmental protections and should have the same access to influence environmental decision-making. This is a good idea to strive for, but it's rarely the case. In this country, pollutant-spewing factories or hazardous waste treatment, storage, and disposal sites are hardly ever located on the good side of town or next to the country club. In fact, it is often the lower socioeconomic classes that end up living in and around pollution. If we expand our thinking of environmental justice to include climate change, are we really doing the ethical thing by lowering carbon dioxide emissions inside the U.S. if others around the world don't do the same? Should we give other countries a voice in our policy decisions since they would be affected too? Some political issues related to climate change policy. Climate change regulation will almost certainly include some kind of tax or increased costs or fees. Our text spoke a lot about how an increase in gasoline taxes would drive a reduction in gasoline uses and associated greenhouse gases, but the gasoline taxes are rarely passed because of the public's response to such taxes. Nobody likes to pay higher gas taxes or higher gas prices. CAFE standards can and are being raised, but this is also a difficult process. We Americans like big, powerful cars. Every day, millions of us commute to our jobs in empty V8-powered pickup trucks or 707 horsepower Hemi Hellcat-powered sedans. I myself drive a heavy, inefficient, technologically unadvanced SUV 70 miles round trip each day to work at 20 miles per gallon on a good day, so that I can occasionally drive around in the mud or on the rocks on the weekends. A great many of us SUV drivers look down upon, both figuratively and literally, commuters and economy cars with tiny engines. Increasing fuel economy standards will force automakers to make their cars more efficient, which will force some of us into tiny cars, which will cause dissatisfaction with the politicians who we see as forcing that move. Environmental policy and regulations often have a different flavor during Democratic and Republican administrations. A Democrat-controlled House and Senate will pass different environmental legislation than a Republican-controlled legislature. The success or failure of climate change policy will have a lot to do with who is in power when it is developed and implemented. In summary, environmental and economic policy is complicated and imperfect. Despite that, we've made significant progress in improving environmental quality and protecting natural resources since the late 20th century. Continued improvement is possible, but it's going to take work and compromise. Thank you.